wonderful that we are here together to learn from the incomparable Alan Elsner, who is going to teach us this morning. Alan, I'm going to begin by reading your bio because it's really an extraordinary journey you've been on through the years, and it's a pleasure to share some of it with us, to introduce us to Alan this morning. Alan Elsner had a long career at the top ranks of American and international journalism and a long record of Jewish and pro-Israel advocacy. As State Department and later White House correspondent for Reuters news agency, Elsner traveled the world with secretaries of state and on Air Force One. His sharp questioning during the Rwanda genocide forced the United States to change its policy and was later highlighted in the Hollywood movie Hotel Rwanda. Elsner is an Israeli citizen who was a volunteer during the Yom Kippur War and served in the IDF during the 1982 Lebanon War. As Reuters national correspondent, Elsner was the agency's chief writer on 9/11 and through the subsequent period. Elsner is the author of 2 novels and 2 works of nonfiction. His first book, Gates of Injustice: The Crisis in America's Prisons, was hailed by the late Senator Edward Kennedy as a wake-up call and welcomed by the political left and right. His first novel, The Nazi Hunter, was described by Publishers Weekly as a gripping debut thriller and a compelling tale. His memoir, Guarded by Angels, about his father's Holocaust survival in World War II, was published by Yad Vashem. He spearheaded a campaign to build a fitting memorial at the site of the Belzec extermination camp in Poland, where his grandparents were murdered by the Nazis. Winner of the Knight International Journalism Fellowship, Elsner spent a year in Romania in 2007 teaching journalism to students and professionals and strengthening the values of a free media. He spent 6 years with J Street as vice president for communications and senior advisor to the president of the organization. Other than that, Alan, why did you do something with your life? It is really a pleasure to introduce you. And just a note, Alan will be speaking, and then I'd like to leave some time for Alan to address any questions. So if you do have questions during the course of his speech, please enter them into the chat section, and I will endeavor, together with Alan, he and I will both look at the chat and respond to them. Okay, so Alan, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome. And thanks also to Rabbi Steinlauf for inviting me to give this talk about the US prison system. Let me just start by listing my kind of bona fides to speak about this subject. Around 15 years ago, when I was national correspondent for Reuters, I wrote a series of around 20 articles about various aspects of the prison system. They caught the eye of a publisher, Financial Times Books, and I was invited to turn my work into a book. It actually took a lot more work and months of research, but it did eventually appear under the title Gates of Injustice, the Crisis in America's Prisons. The picture that you see actually on the cover is the female chain gang in Maricopa County, Arizona, where the sheriff at the time was running this outdoor prisons and female chain gangs, and eventually was convicted of various corruption, got pardoned by President Trump. In the course of my reporting, I visited more than 20 jails and prisons in all parts of the country. I conducted literally hundreds of interviews with inmates and former inmates, also with prison guards, or as they prefer to be called, corrections officers, with prison wardens, with police and police officers, and cops on the beat, with judges, gang members, mental health professionals, prosecutors and defense attorneys, advocates, academics, family members of the incarcerated, social workers, business people, and politicians. I did ride-alongs with the police in Baltimore, Las Vegas, and in Watts in Los Angeles. I joined needle distribution programs, including one that was illegal. I went undercover into a jail in Virginia holding immigrants and asylum seekers, and I witnessed and uncovered horrible physical abuse. I unfortunately also followed a death penalty case in real time, interviewing everyone I could find that had been involved, including the accused man whom I spoke to twice, the last time 4 hours before he was put to death. And I witnessed that execution, which is a scene that has remained with me for years. I would have expected that much of the information in the book was now outdated, since the book appeared for the first time in 2003, I believe, and then a second edition a couple of years later. And obviously some of the statistics are a bit on the old side. Unfortunately, the situation I described remains largely unchanged, or in fact has gotten even worse. When I wrote my book, there were 2.1 million Americans behind bars, and today there are 2.3 million Americans behind bars. Over 500,000 are in pre-trial detention, meaning they haven't actually been committed of any crime. They are there in jail because they're poor and they can't make bail. In my book, I did make some proposals for reform and testified about them to various bodies, including congressional committees, and some have been acted on, but most have not. Sadly, we still have a crisis in our prison system, which constitutes a massive abuse of human rights, an instrument of white supremacy, and a national disgrace. When we talk about racism in America, we soon realize that it permeates every aspect of life, from housing to education to employment to policing. You find it everywhere. But the prison system is the sharp end of the whole corrupt system. There's nothing subtle about racism in prison. It's where racism unleashes its full brutality without any filters, without pretense, without restraint. It's where the mask is ripped off. The first thing that I want you to understand, which I don't think most people do, about our prison system is how colossal it is. The United States has around 5% of the world's people, but about 25% of its prisoners. We lock up our poor, our uneducated, our unruly, our unstable, our addicted, where other countries provide treatment, mental facilities, and care. We have way more Americans in bars, behind bars, than working on farms or in higher education. African Americans are about 11% of our total population, but they're about 40% of the prison and jail population. Since I wrote my book, the proportion of African Americans serving prison sentences in state prisons has fallen a little bit, but the jail system has taken up the slack, as have immigrants in detention. And almost 1 in 3 African American men and almost 1 in 5 Hispanic men can expect to spend some time in prison during their lives. Just to clarify here, when I talk about prisons and jails, in some kind of languages, the term is interchangeable. They're not the same. Jails are run by counties, and therefore people who are awaiting trial or who have been sentenced to short sentences, normally under 18 months. Prisons are run by states and by the federal government, and that's where you get sent after you're convicted and sentenced to a more substantial sentence. So that's just a word of clarification. The figures are shocking, but what's important to realize was it wasn't always this way. You may think that the roots of our prison system lie in Reconstruction or in Jim Crow. They don't. The explosive growth of our prisons was a result of deliberate policies enacted by federal and state governments in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And they were done by Republicans and Democrats alike. If you want to single out some of the prime movers, you would have to include President Ronald Reagan, but also House Speaker Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, who was the architect of some of the most damaging congressional legislation that was passed at that time. For most of the 20th century, our prison population was remarkably stable. It was about 0.1% of all Americans. In 1972, which I take as a baseline, we had about 325,000 people behind bars, representing about 160 of every 10,000 of the population. This was a little higher, but not dramatically out of line with other Western democracies. Now, if you fast forward 28 years to the year 2000, you'll find the figure had gone from 168 per 10,000 to 702 per 10,000. And by 2016, it was still going up and had reached 716 per 10,000. To give some international comparisons, at that point, the United Kingdom was 138, France 90, Sweden 60, and Japan 40, and we're at 716. And what this tells us is that we had more than tripled the size of our prison system in the space of a single generation. How and why did this happen? The prison population started to balloon at the same moment when the civil rights movement faltered in the late 1960s. The key year, I believe, was 1968, the same year that Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. And many of our inner cities went up in flames, as we've been reading about again and reminding ourselves of recently. And many people comparing this moment we're living through now to that moment. I think we have to pray and we have to work hard to ensure that the results are dramatically different. 1968 was a fulcrum, a turning point in all the wrong ways. President Johnson's war on poverty gave way to Richard Nixon's war on drugs. Governors started pushing through long and punitive sentences for even minor drug possession charges, and the policy was heavily enforced by police in African-American inner city neighborhoods, while it was almost entirely unenforced in white suburbs, even though social science research tells us that African Americans and whites used and still use drugs in about the same proportions. If you used crack cocaine, you could expect to serve many years in jail or in prison. If you snorted powder cocaine, the authorities turned a blind eye. Chemical composition of the two was exactly the same, but crack cocaine was used in the inner cities by African Americans, and powder cocaine was a white drug thought of as edgy and trendy and glamorous, a favorite of Wall Street traders and Hollywood A-listers. My book is full of hair-raising statistics. I just picked one for today because I don't want to burden you with too many numbers. In Illinois in the year 2000, an African American was 57 times more likely than a white man to be incarcerated for drugs. The police focused all of their attention on black neighborhoods. It went on for decades. It's still going on. I'm glad we're finally paying attention today. In the 1980s and 1990s, Congress passed a series of so-called tough on crime bills. All 50 states followed suit. California, for example, enacted 3 strikes and you're out. Many states eliminated parole. The slogan was, do the crime, do the time. That meant no incentive for good behavior behind bars. As we recall, George H.W. Bush won the presidency in 1988, largely on the back of the notorious Willie Horton TV ad. Politicians vied to outdo each other in presenting themselves as tough on crime. Local TV stations, news stations, focused heavily on sensational crime stories, and they still do. It creates the impression that we're living through a crime pandemic and that we're all threatened all the time. Yet crime rates fell precipitously, especially after 1990. The mass arrests of African Americans and Hispanics led to a huge prison construction boom. From 1985 to 1995, state and federal authorities were putting up new prisons at the rate of 1 per week. Let me repeat that. From 1985 to 1995, we were building 1 new prison every week. And you can tell a society's priorities by the way it spends its money. At the same time that prisons sprouted up all around the nation like mushrooms, we cut back on K through 12 education as well as higher education in many states. California, for example, added 100 prisons in the 1980s and 1990s and not a single new college. In 1960, the Texas prison system had about 14,000 inmates in 12 what were known as penal farms. These were ghastly places. They were basically plantations where inmates worked like slaves raising crops, but it was a relatively small-scale system. By the year 2000, Texas had 144 prisons with over 150,000 inmates, costing the state $3 billion a year. So they went from 12 prisons to 144 prisons in the space of 40 years, and they went from 14,000 to 150,000 inmates. Incidentally, there are still some of these plantation prisons in the South. The most notorious are the infamous Angola prison in Louisiana and Parchment in Mississippi, both of which I visited. In Angola, when I was there, the warden lived in a mansion inside the prison grounds overlooking the Mississippi River. It was very bucolic and lovely. And he was served by a vast staff of inmates known as trustees who were wearing white uniforms. There were waiters, valets, and even a butler. It was like stepping into the age of Gone with the Wind. As the prison expanded, prisons also became harsher. States cut vocational training cut corners on healthcare and food, cut drug and alcohol treatment and education. Prison guards left inmates largely to themselves for most of the time, apart from counting them several times a day. Prison rape became an epidemic, tens of thousands of cases a year. And by law, prisons are not supposed to be racially segregated, but in reality, they are the most segregated places in America. And the internal affairs of prisons are run basically by criminal gangs along race lines. The Aryan Brotherhood got its start in San Quentin in the mid-1960s. They run drug trafficking, protection rackets, extortion, prostitution, both inside and outside of prisons. It's a revolving door for some of their most hardened members. Rival Latino gangs representing different parts of Mexico and different Central American nations fight each other both inside and outside of prison. And there are the Bloods and the Crips and other gangs who force inmates to join them for protection or force them to pay for protection when they're behind bars. You may have read, I saw an op-ed in the Washington Post online this week by Steve J. Martin, a corrections expert for the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. And he wrote, correctional officers routinely employ tasers, stun shields, pepper balls, and gas guns, restraint chairs, expandable batons, attack dogs, and even their own fists and feet to subdue inmates. This results in bruises, lacerations, fractured limbs, chemical burns, perforated eardrums, severe concussions, and injuries to internal organs. All too often, these injuries result in needless death. In death cases I've investigated, the prisoners who died were disproportionately Black. Many also had mental impairments. Indeed, that staff disproportionately targeted such prisoners for violence, even when their illnesses prevented them from understanding orders or complying. Many of the new prisons that we built in the boom of the 1980s and 1990s were built in white rural areas where traditional industries like mining and logging had collapsed. Places like the southwest corner of Virginia, Wise County, where two ghastly so-called Supermax prisons were built, Red Onion and Wallens Ridge. These prisons offered low-paying and often soul-destroying work to the local population as prison guards. The only economic value, it seems, that our society put on our African-American men was as raw material to fill these prisons, many of which were run by for-profit corporations. And in some prisons, the inmates were put to work for a few cents an hour in factories or even manning coal centers. In the US Census, which is going on right now as we speak, prisoners are counted as residents of the counties where they're incarcerated rather than of their hometowns. And this, of course, inflates the population of white rural areas at the expense of inner cities. It results in more federal aid flowing to these areas at the expense of the places where the inmates actually live. And it even plays into congressional redistricting, even though inmates can't vote. More, because prisoners were incarcerated hundreds of miles away from their hometowns, it became much more difficult for their families to visit. And we know from social science, actually from common sense, that maintaining family ties and ties to the community is crucial if an inmate is to have any chance of succeeding after his or her release. If an inmate tried to call home, they have to call collect, and their families are often charged up to $15 a minute. Phone companies split the profit with the prisons, which is daylight robbery by the rich from the poorest of the poor, in fact, Robin Hood in reverse. What was even worse was that we created a system where poor whites largely supervised poor African Americans. And in many parts of the country, and not just in the South, in fact, far from it, there have been well-documented cases of racist abuse by guards. Prisoners are put into 5-point restraints for hours on end, tased, beaten, and abused, every day subject to racist taunts. In the years that our nation built hundreds of new prisons, we also closed most of our mental hospitals and failed to build alternative treatment sites in the community. And so prisons became the dumping ground for the seriously mentally ill. Los Angeles County Jail became the largest mental hospital in the world. It still is, by far. And Rikers Island is close behind. An estimated 15% of the prison population, which comes out of over 300,000 people, are thought to be mentally ill, and they receive little or no treatment. In fact, they're often punished for their behavior, and many wind up in total isolation in segregation wings or at Supermaxes, where their suffering and illness only gets worse. Fortunately, the one thing that's changed since I wrote my book is that many states have become disenchanted with the horrible Supermax prisons they built to house the so-called worst of the worst in conditions of total isolation. And let me explain what a Supermax is. In a Supermax, every inmate is held in an individual cell in isolation. Their food is slid under through a partition in the bars 3 times a day. But apart from that, they have no human contact whatsoever. They have 1 hour of outside recreation, but that again is in isolation. And so they see no other human beings whatsoever for the time of their incarceration. And I think if you try to imagine that you yourself were subject to this kind of regime, you quickly, I think, give way to a complete mental collapse when you consider that many of the people who are placed in these circumstances are already mentally ill. You can just imagine the result. But many states did give up on this not because they became appalled by the horrific cruelty that they were imposing, but more that they saw how much more expensive it is to hold inmates one to a cell in complete isolation. And they also realized that most of these worst of the worst are actually acutely disturbed and distressed individuals rather than serial killers or rapists. Prison guards often told me how much they hate dealing with the mentally ill, who can be unpredictable, sometimes aggressive, and some of them are unable to handle the demands of personal hygiene, so it's very unpleasant dealing with them. And as a result, guards in low or medium security prisons want to get rid of these people, so they start writing them up for infractions, hoping to get them off the books. And many times they succeed, so that these inmates who are mentally ill are labeled as insubordinate, unable to follow rules, and dumped in more and more secure prisons and in segregation and eventually in Supermaxes. So the bottom line that you have to kind of draw from this is that in America, mental illness itself has become a crime punishable by long-term prison terms in the most awful conditions imaginable. Prisons are also the breeding ground for various infectious diseases, as we are unfortunately seeing now during the coronavirus. You may not be aware that apart from members of the military, prisoners are actually the only people in our country who have the right to healthcare. You and I don't have that as a right. It's not our right to have healthcare, and in fact, millions of Americans don't have health insurance. But prisoners do have that right, since they're basically wards of the state. Most prison systems privatized healthcare, giving fat contracts to corporations which promise to cut costs. Hepatitis C and sexually transmitted diseases run rampant in the prison system. There have also been regular tuberculosis outbreaks, and prisoners who tend not to be kind of the most healthy of people in the first place suffer disproportionately from hypertension, diabetes, asthma, and other conditions. When I visited Angola prison in Louisiana, I heard about something called a ping pong toilet. And what is a ping pong toilet? It means when a toilet flushes in one cell, fecal material goes straight to the next cell along and bubbles up. And when it's flushed in the second cell, it goes back to the first, hence the term ping pong. Often it just overflows. And on that summer's day when I was there, it was well over 100 degrees and there was no air conditioning. Because many states abolished parole as part of their tough on crime policies, many thousands of prisoners are growing old behind bars, and they naturally suffer from the same infirmities as the rest of the population: Alzheimer's, dementia, heart conditions, cancer. I once met an inmate in North Carolina who no longer remembered who he was, much less what he'd done. In California's Central Valley, prisoners are transported 50 or 60 miles back and forth 3 times a week for kidney dialysis in Sacramento, but they can't be released to their families. Oh no, because why? Do the crime, do the time. Some prisons have had to set up hospices which are manned by fellow inmates for those who are dying. And in Angola, they had such a hospice. It was actually very moving to meet some of the inmates who volunteered their services to help their fellow inmates through their final days. And as one said to me, I'm doing this for this inmate in the hope that somebody one day does it for me, would be more, it would be cheaper, it would be more compassionate to send these people home to die with their loved ones, but you can't do that because why? Do the crime, do the time. Now you may ask how many people are in these categories, and the answer is we don't know. We collect vast numbers of statistics about the prison system, but one statistic that we do not collect is how many people die in prison behind bars every year. The nation does not collect proper statistics on deaths or on the causes of deaths behind bars. Steve Martin, the prison expert I previously quoted, says, and I agree with him, we need accountability for the misuse of force. Too few officers face sanctions even for killing a detainee. Internal reviews often fail to provide meaningful scrutiny. The testimony of inmate witnesses is discounted. And as with the police, the code of silence among prison staffs helps protect abusive officers. Autopsies and death certificates often ignore the use of force that might have precipitated the death. In other words, you can kill somebody in prison and get away with it. Women behind bars, it's about 10% of the total, have a particular health needs, which are usually not adequately met. Astoundingly, 15 years after I described this in my book, there are still cases of pregnant women being taken to the hospital to give birth in shackles. In some women's prisons, male guards are still allowed to conduct strip searches and cavity searches with female inmates. Now, when we incarcerate people, we also punish their families. Millions of children are being forced to grow up without parents who are incarcerated. On any given day, about 1 in 14 African-American children has a parent behind bars. But over the course of a childhood, obviously the figure is much larger. Children with parents behind bars exhibit many troubling symptoms: rage, guilt, low self-esteem, depression. They're more likely to live in poverty and suffer abuse, and more likely to end up in juvenile and then in adult prisons themselves. The abused becomes the abuser. The cycle is perpetuated. With so many African-American males incarcerated, the social fabric holding neighborhoods together collapsed in many cities. You find neighborhoods where women far outnumber men, and many men just move from one sexual relationship to the next, getting women pregnant and taking no responsibility. And you find teenage women raising children with little or no support. Stable two-parent families become rarer, and schools have lacked investment. There are no after-school activities. What happens? Gangs step into the vacuum, recruit kids at a young age. So many people that I've interviewed, gang members, say that they regard the gang as their family because they don't have an actual family. And yet again, that perpetuates the cycle. We've also heard a lot recently, and you'll be relieved to know I'm coming to the end, about the militarization of the police. On the infamous day recently when Lafayette Park was cleared of peaceful protesters so that President Trump could have a photo op, some of the forces active in the square were prison SWAT teams brought there by the federal authorities. I saw this militarization with my own eyes when I attended 3 days of exercises at a former prison in Wheeling, West Virginia. SWAT teams, are armed to the teeth, came from all over the country to practice violently quelling riots, which are actually extremely rare in our prison system. I looked up a database to get the latest figures on riots in the US prison system, and I actually found only 5 listed since the beginning of 2015. That's an average of 1 per year in the whole nation. They usually occur only when the conditions get to be really, really terrible and the inmates feel that they have no other recourse. Yet these SWAT teams trained as if they would all be facing riots on a weekly or monthly basis. They wore armor like Darth Vader, and they practiced busting into cells using tear gas, stun guns, nightsticks, and even live ammunition. And a bevy of companies, including, unfortunately, several Israeli firms, had descended on Wheeling with samples and brochures and videos and demonstrations to hawk their wares to the prison authorities, eager to acquire the latest military equipment. Now, one thing I don't want to talk about today is the debate going on in our nation about defunding the police. But I do think we should largely defund the prison system. I believe it could be shrunk down to about 10% of its current size, which would bring us into line with other Western democracies, and we would actually be just as safe. In fact, I believe we'd be much safer because we'd save billions of dollars, which could be spent on so much more productive means. Murderers and rapists and child abusers and violent robbers and big white collar criminals could still be behind bars, should be behind bars. But hundreds of thousands of small-time drug users could easily be diverted to treatment in the community. Likewise, for the mentally ill. Families would be left intact, communities would not be emptied of young people, gangs would lose their recruitment grounds, and our nation would no longer have the shame of presiding over a system that is racist, immensely cruel, and sick to its core. And with that, I will conclude and take questions.
Alan, thank you so much for this very painful and very difficult exploration of a place where our society is truly beyond sick. It is, this is a place where evil is fully functional in the society that we purport to love and be a part of and benefit from. And I think it's a very difficult reality that hopefully we're able to reckon with. I'm reminded, Alan, of a teaching I did recently about our slavery in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, and how the Torah describes how the Egyptians enslaved us bifarech, which translates literally as in a way that breaks us, in a way that is meant to break our spirit, a society that exists to literally destroy the humanity of an entire population. We are living in a society that clearly is still enslaving whole populations. And we have some comments. Can you see the comments there, Alan, if you want to take a look at them and see which ones you'd like to respond to?
I don't know what's going to happen in the 2030 though. So Amy Sheldon says, my totally unofficial understanding is the rationale behind counting prison inmates as residents of where the prison is located might be reevaluated for the 2030 census. Who knows what's going to happen in the 2030 census? I guess it depends on, who's in power. The current system, I don't want to make this a partisan talk, but the current system does clearly benefit Republicans. It benefits poor, basically rural white districts over mainly minority inner cities, so that they have a vested interest in retaining the system. You may have followed what seems to be the endless ins and outs of the question of former felons getting the right to vote in Florida. And we have a system where if you serve your sentence and you're returned to the community, in many states, you're still penalized in that you are disenfranchised basically forever, for the rest of your lives. In the state of Florida, hundreds of thousands of people are in this situation, and they passed a referendum to allow them to regain the right to vote. You would think that when somebody had actually been rehabilitated and returned to the community, it would actually spur the rehabilitation to give them the full rights of citizenships. Again, after all, if they pay taxes, they'll have the right to vote. The Republican Party has had a real stubborn regard action to try and prevent them from doing this using various means. One of them is you can't get the right to vote if you owe any money in let's say spousal support, back pay. Well, of course, if you've been in prison for 5 years, you haven't been paying your spousal support or your child support, and you can be, deeply indebted. And this is used simply as a mechanism to prevent former felons from voting. So I have no idea what's going to happen in the 2030 census, too far in the future. But what I think is it's very hard to change the system. The only change that I've seen that's happened has been when Republicans and Democrats have united to force change and usually they come from it from different points of view. Democrats come from more of a kind of human rights point of view. Republicans come from a fiscal point of view. When it gets to be really, really expensive to maintain the system and it's actually bankrupting states, or then they start to look at reforms. I see a message from, there are a lot of messages here.
I can help you go through them if you'd like.
Yeah, the one I think about Angola from Jean speaks for itself. How does the Black Lives Movement interact with mass incarceration? I think that mass incarceration is part of the, and the need to combat it is part of the Black Lives Movement. It's part of the thoroughgoing reform of the criminal justice system, which prisons is a part of. So I think that, there's a keen awareness that, in fact, one of the most promising avenues, I believe, for the Black Lives Movement is prison reform. And Congress has done a few things since I wrote my book. It did pass a comprehensive bill on prison rape, which basically mandated the prison system to collect statistics about rape. And of course, once you start collecting statistics, prisons become anxious to not be not to be cast in a poor light by showing a rampant problem. So that did do something.
There's a note here that says the work of Angela Davis on the prison industrial complex is central to the Black Lives Matter movement's call for an end to systemic racism. Look up 8 Can't Wait. 8 demands of the movement include a call to free people from the prison system.
Right. Well, one of the things that to me is, very, very depressing is that in the height of the coronavirus crisis that we're in, prisons are obviously have emerged as a hotspot for the spread of the disease. Yet, and some states have called for, there's almost nothing you can do within a prison system to keep people safe from this disease. There's no such thing as social distancing or wearing masks. And the only thing you can basically do is cleaning surfaces. That's about it. And of course, the spread of the disease doesn't only endanger inmates, because it's spread very easily to members of staff, not just corrections officers who then take it home into the community to their families, but also other people who work in the system, providing food, providing healthcare, administrators, educators, etc. So it's a hotspot, it's a vector for the spread of the disease. The most effective thing you could do is actually release lots and lots of people. Some states have tried, in California, the Governor Newsom has called for the release of about 10% of the prison population, but there are very strict criteria. You have to be in the last year of your sentence. You have to be convicted of a non-violent crime. I mean, all kinds of conditions that are placed on this, and so in fact they have succeeded in releasing very, very few people.
There's a question here, Alan. Could you say something about the incentivization and motivation of judges to feed the prison population with an ample supply of prisoners?
One of the things that happened to the legal system was that was the imposition of compulsory sentence guidelines, so that judges actually lost their ability to use their discretion in imposing sentences in many cases. And the literature is replete with cases of judges who say, I think that the sentence that I'm about to pass on you is ridiculous. In California, 3 strikes and you're out, there were people who their third crime was something as petty as stealing some videos from from CVS, or petty theft, and they were then sentenced to life in prison because this was their third offense. And judges had lost the ability to actually decide on appropriate sentences. They had no choice. Their hands were tied by legislatures. I want to say something else about that. I was once witness to some parole hearings. And parole was, in classic prison theory, the prison system was supposed to fulfill three functions. The first is, well, I'm having a senior moment. One of them is obviously punishment, and one was rehabilitation. When people behave well in prison, they were deemed to be no danger to the community, they could be released on parole. What happened in parole hearings was that the family members of the victims were able to come to the parole hearing and testify. Now, parole hearing is not rerunning the trial. It's not about what they did and were convicted for. It's about how they've behaved since they've been behind bars. Have they followed the rules? Have they educated themselves? Have they been productive members of the prison community? Have they acquired some skills that they could use afterwards? It's really not about the original crime. But when you bring family members in to testify, and this is what I saw, I did this in New Hampshire. What happened was, there was a woman who was convicted to life imprisonment because at the age of 21, her boyfriend killed his wife. He was having an affair with this woman, and she was committed, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment as an accomplice, as an accessory to that crime. She had been a model. She'd been by then in prison for 25 years already. She had been a model inmate. I actually corresponded with her for quite a while after that. She'd been a model inmate, and she was seen as a mother figure to all the younger inmates who came into the system. A very positive person, actually. But every time she came up from parole, members of the family of the dead woman who had been murdered came and testified, and she basically given up hope of ever being able to get out of prison, ever being able to pay that crime, and she was of no danger to the community whatsoever.
There's a question, Alan, about the privatization of the prison system, and can you speak a little bit more to that issue of the effect that has had on the advocacy for prison reform?
Right. So when I wrote my book, about 15% of the prison system had been turned over to private corporations. And one of the reasons that became productive to do so was that in order to build a prison in a community, you have to raise funds. And usually those funds are raised through a bond issue. But in many cases, that's subject to a referendum of citizens. Do you approve the bond issue for the purpose of building this prison? Some of the localities found it very difficult to get these approved. The private system comes along with another solution, which is we'll front all the money up front for the building of the prison. You don't have to pay a dime, you, the taxpayers, and you will get the money back in the annual fees that you pay us to run this prison system. So you pay the corporation, the county or the state or whatever it is, pays the corporation an annual fee to run the prison system. And part of that fee over the course of 5 or 10 years compensates them for the cost of building it. The advantage is that the citizens then don't get a say. So many counties and states found this to be a productive way of getting prisons built, which they were interested in doing because the prisons did provide jobs, not great jobs, not high-paying jobs, but jobs. Jobs are jobs. Some of the corporations actually started building prisons on spec without getting a contract from the county, on the basis of, build it and they will come. And in most cases, they did come. There was one in Georgia, I think it was Wackenhut Corporation, built a prison without anyone asking them to do so. And then they had a nice empty prison standing there. And of course, who filled that prison? ICE. Because our immigration authorities need need prisons to put immigrants in. And this was the case before the Trump administration. Let's be quite clear about this. It did not originate with the Trump administration. Of course, it's got much worse with the Trump administration. So obviously, if you're a corporation and you're running a prison, your aim is to make a profit. How do you make a profit? You minimize costs wherever possible. So you basically provide very few services in the prison system. You basically incarcerate people, you warehouse them, but you provide no services for them because services cut costs. Services cost money. And even if you didn't privatize the whole prison, parts of the prison system were privatized almost everywhere, like food. You know, prison systems don't want to provide their own food, so they bring in Sodexo or another big food provider to provide food, and they too cut costs. Worst of all is health is provided by private corporations, and they cut costs. It's interesting when it comes to services. In some prisons, the only basic education service they now provide is the what's it called? The high school equivalent, the what's it called? You know, when you don't graduate high school, but you get a certificate. Somebody chime in here. I'm having a senior moment. The
GDE, I think it's called.
GDE. Thank you, Stula. The GDE, right. So I was at this prison in upstate New York, and this inmate was in there for a white-collar crime. He actually had a PhD. And he described to me on his very first day in this prison, he was asked to pass the GED. He said, I don't need to pass the GED. I have a doctorate. They said, no, but everyone takes the GED here. So he sat down and he filled in the form, and wherever he put his pencil, everyone around him put their pencil. And as I was going out, one of the prison administrators said, we have a great GED program here, and he showed me this graph of how the number of people passing the GED was going way up. So they make people who have a PhD pass the GED, and that helps the statistics.
There's a question, Alan, about are there any real examples of prisons that are successful, truly successful in terms of things like education and lower recidivism rates? Are there examples that are positive lights?
I mean, there are places like San Quentin, which is just a short distance outside of San Francisco. Many of you, if you go up Route 1, north of you, cross the Golden Gate Bridge, and you pass Sausalito, and the next thing you're going to see on the left-hand side in a beautiful position overlooking the ocean is San Quentin. And because of its geographical location, you know, a lot of people go and volunteer there and provide services for free. So you can get college courses there provided by members of the faculty of Berkeley, and the prison authorities actually, if it's not costing them any money, they're quite happy to have these services because it keeps people busy. And when people are busy, they're less likely to be, you know, trouble. If you keep people stimulated and if you give them hope, it helps calm the situation, and the prison works a lot better. So if you have a prison that's located, you know, a short distance away from a major university or from a major urban area, people can then volunteer there out of the goodness of their heart and provide a more positive kind of experience. And those places do exist, but unfortunately, as I said, many prisons are located far from major population centers, and this was by design, as I explained. Sometimes you go into a system and you think, wow, this is great. You know, I went to Bedford Hills, which is a prison for women in Westchester County, New York. And in that prison, they had a program they had a creche where women who had young babies were able to keep their babies with them behind bars. And they actually had classes on mothering and how to bathe your baby and how to feed your baby and other stuff like that. And I thought, you know, this is fantastic. They were only allowed to keep them up to the age of 18 months. So women who were subject to long sentences were not able to participate in this program. But if you had a sentence of maybe a couple of years, you could participate. And I thought this was, tremendous. Then so I wrote a story about this in fairly kind of glowing terms, and I do think it's a good program. Unfortunately, there was then a class action suit filed by women inmates in Bedford Hills, alleging, and I think that they won the case, horrific sexual abuse by most of the prison guards were male. A horrible sexual abuse by the prison guards, who would give some of these women favors in exchange for sexual services. So, for instance, a guard would smuggle a cell phone into a woman, or a guard would allow a woman to or have use of his cell phone to phone their family without having to do it collect and have to pay the enormous fees. And then there's the other way, the carrot and the stick. The stick is, if you don't sleep with me, I'll make sure that you don't get a family visit next month. So the system, any system where all the power is in the hand of one side and zero power is in the hand of the other side, is a system that is open to abuse. And that's just human nature, I think. When you add in the sexual politics of women being guarded by men, and I actually think that one of the reforms that I suggested was women's prisons should be overseen and staffed exclusively by women and not by men. The men should not have, if the men could work there, but they would not have direct contact with female inmates. But that has not happened. And so when you have these situations where all the power is on one side and the other side is completely powerless and has no recourse, and even if you complain, nobody will listen to you, then that's what happens. The system is abused.
Ellen, we have time for maybe two more questions. There's a question about if you could address transition issues like jobs, healthcare, education, housing, et cetera, and the state of that.
Right. So the fact that we have cut back on so many educational services in the prison system means that recidivism is extremely high. And I have statistics in my book. I actually can't recall them, but it was something like 33% at that time, and I don't believe it's any different now, would reoffend within 2 years. There also some of the legislation that was passed was extremely punitive towards ex-inmates. For instance, they were not able to get federal housing aid because they had served time. So again, once you commit the crime, you don't. When you finish serving your sentence, it follows you around like a weight on your back for the rest of your lives. Additionally, most people, if they do get out, they're subject to then a period of probation. We cut back severely, nearly every state, on probation officers. So a probation officer would have a caseload of 10, 15 prisoners once. Now they have 40 or 50. What does this mean? They don't have time to devote to the people on their probation list. So what they try to do is try to get people off the list. And the way you do that is bust them back for any minor infraction. Let's say a prisoner fails to appear for a probation meeting or is 15 minutes late. Probation officer is severely overworked. They say, oh, right, that's a probation violation. Get them off the list, one less for me to worry about, and they're shunted back into prison, even though they actually haven't committed another crime at all. Or they fail a urine test or something like that. So the whole system is built for people to fail. It's extremely, extremely difficult. And of course, many employers will not give a job, they won't give a chance to a former inmate. And if they do give a chance, and and that person then reoffends, they'll never do it again, and they'll tell all their friends never to do it again. So the system, the best thing that you can do, there are two things that you can do to try and help people reacclimatize to civilian life after serving time in prison. First is give them some trade while they're in prison that they can actually earn a living. And there can be programs when they get out of prison, just like internships or something like that, where they can gradually move back into the community. The second one is maintain contact with their families. Because if you're in contact with your family, you have a support network. You have a reason, also an incentive to succeed. But we've done everything we can to make it more difficult for families to stay in touch with people behind bars. We incarcerate them, as I said, hundreds of miles away from in DC is a perfect example. In DC, people used to be incarcerated. There's a DC county jail, but there was a prison in Northern Virginia where people were incarcerated. It was a short, bus ride. That place was closed. And now DC prisoners, they sent into the federal prison system. They could be sent anywhere in the country. They can be sent to Alaska. They can be sent to Leavenworth in Kansas. But there are no federal prisons, within 2 or 3 hours drive of DC. So automatically you take them out of contact with their families. And when they come back, they're not rooted in the community.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I'm going to combine, actually, I think, a couple of the questions. Question about, so what can we do, Alan, and also what should be the top priority, or among the top priorities, but also there's a real interest in what can we do at this point to begin to rectify this deeply entrenched, horrific system in our society.
Right. Well, I make a bunch of different recommendations in my book, which I think are still valid, and I can go through them. But one of the good things I think has happened is the legalization of marijuana in different places of the country has meant that people are not being incarcerated for the use of marijuana anymore, and I think that's good. So I mean, let me just quickly go through. This, but one thing we should do is we should stop prosecuting people for drugs offenses in the normal court system. We can set up, and some states have, and some counties have, drug courts, which basically divert people into treatment programs so that they would be kept out of the system. The mentally ill. We need to basically release most of the mentally ill, but we also need to invest in services for mentally ill in the community. And that would get rid of 15% of the population right there and then. When we closed down some of the mental hospitals that we had here in the 50s and 60s were not pleasant places. Anyone who's seen one over the Cuckoo's Nest knows that, and Nurse Ratched and the rest of it, that they were not pleasant places. But the deal was, when we closed those places down, that we would invest the money that we had spent on them on treatment centers in the community. Now, if you're mentally ill but you're rich, you can get treatment, and you will stay out of prison. We need community-based treatment sentences for the mentally ill, and we need to follow up on them after their release. Rehabilitation. We need to invest in education in the prison system so that people can get out. California, I have here, fired 260 prison instructors in 2003 because there was nothing else to cut. We need to have people working or studying while they're serving their sentences. Either they should be working or they should be studying. They should not be sitting around doing nothing. And then we need to incentivize good behavior and get them out. We need to have good anti-addiction programs inside the prison system, because if somebody comes out addicted, and what happens you can get anything you want in the prison system smuggled into you. You can get pretty much any drug you want. But even if you stop cold turkey while you're behind bars because you can't, for one reason or another, get hold of the drugs that you want, that is not a cure. That's just a temporary stop. The minute you get out, you're going to reoffend. I believe we need to reform the census system, as I've spoken. We need to allow, I wrote this here in 2003, we need to allow felons, former felons to vote. We need, instead of having corporations look after health, we could have health practitioners from the community. You know, there are many other things, but I think that basically we need to stop investing in this system, and then they would have, if we don't provide the budget, they would have to go through their roles very, very carefully, and they would have to release a vast number of people who are not doing it, who would not do any harm. You know, we know from tons of research that the vast number of offenses are committed by young males between the ages of, say, 15 to 35. Those are the outside edges. Once people pass the age of 35, they're really not interested in doing crime anymore. You know, whatever it is, I don't know, hormones or something, aging. So they're very little danger to the community. We could release vast numbers of people, many of whom have been there for a long time. And you know, another thing I didn't mention in my talk is one of the things that we do in this country, as opposed to other countries, is we give much more severe sentences for non-violent crimes. You know, in most other countries, if you go to Scandinavia, if you do a non-violent crime, you're likely not going to go to prison at all. But if you do go, you're going to go for a short time. And here we send people for inordinate amounts of time. And sometimes, you know, you get a 1 year or 2 year sentence, you come out, you reoffend, you're back, you come out, you reoffend again, you're back. And I actually followed a guy in DC who started off, I think he robbed a gas station, got away with $35 or something. And he just got trapped in the system. He could never, ever get free of it. And he ended up serving, you know, and at the time I met him, he was in a halfway house. When he was busted and went back, I lost track of him, but he'd already served 15 years for stealing $35. So, you know, it sounds like Les Miserables, actually.
Indeed. Alan, there's so many wonderful comments rolling in, and I wish we could get to all of them. And we appreciate everybody's comments and really thoughtful questions. Alan, kol hakavod to you. In your really critical and amazing work of raising awareness to these issues and pointing a direction forward for our society. I suppose there is a great deal of hope in these dark times that there is some kind of awakening happening. The one thing we all have to make sure is that more people have access to the kind of insights that you've provided, Alan, and that we really keep everybody awake to this so that we can begin to implement these changes, please God. Again, thank you, Alan. Thank you, everybody, for coming and learning from Alan today. And may we all go from strength to strength in repairing this world and making this place, this country and this world a place of greater justice. Thank you so much, everyone.